In 1922, the Bolsheviks have emerged triumphant from a long and murderous civil war against their enemies. The time had come to cement the revolution in a new form of state that would guarantee the future of communism in a new Soviet empire and spread it around the world. But the Communist Party is not united. Its leaders do not trust each other, and only one will emerge from the ultimate struggle for power, and his name is Josef Stalin. As 1922 began, the Russian Civil War was coming to an end. 5 years of bloody and confused fighting had seen the revolutionary Bolshevik Red Army defeat the counter-revolutionary forces of the White Movement and national independence movements in Belarus, Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. The Bolsheviks had also waged an unrelenting war against the peasants by seizing their grain and killing thousands as part of the Red Terror. These Bolshevik policies resulted in mass peasant uprisings, like the largest ones in Tambov and West Siberia, which the Red Army and Cheka secret police were able to crush. Even Red Army sailors revolted against the Bolsheviks at Kronstadt in 1921. Red Army's success and the end of the First World War also caused the multinational Allied expeditionary forces to withdraw from Russia. The only anti-Bolshevik forces left were a weak white government in Vladivostok and the Japanese occupation force that supported them. As the war had raged, famine and disease claimed the lives of millions, especially in southern Russia and Ukraine. Georgian Bolshevik Josef Stalin had played a prominent role in the revolution and in the Civil War. He'd gained a reputation for ruthlessness as a Red Army commander who cared little for the lives of his men or those of local peasants. By late 1921, he was a member of the Politburo, one of the most important bodies in the party. He was also a loyal follower of Vladimir Lenin, with whom he agreed on most issues, including the controversial new economic policy that abandoned some of Marx and Lenin's economic principles. But for all Stalin's influence, the real power inside the party was based on what government bodies that important members controlled. In Stalin's case, he was responsible for 2 people's commissariats, for nationalities and for worker and peasant inspection. Both of these departments were weak and had few resources. In fact, Stalin himself described the nationalities portfolio as nothing more than propaganda with no administrative authority. So Stalin was important, but his real opportunity for power grew out of an internal party struggle. The 2 most important figures in the party were the leader, Lenin, and War Commissar Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was influential since he had overseen the Red Army's war effort in the successful Civil War. He saw himself as Lenin's equal and sometimes challenged the leader's authority. Lenin wanted to retain his hold on the party, so he banned any internal opposition in a so-called factions ban. But this failed to stop the party leadership from splitting informally. In fact, Lenin depended on an internal alliance with his supporters to keep Trotsky and his supporters in check. One of Lenin's reliable comrades was Josef Stalin, and Lenin needed all the help he could get since his health was failing. Since mid-1921, he suffered badly from headaches, fatigue, even blackouts and bouts of paralysis. He began to spend more and more time at his dacha outside Moscow, away from the corridors of power. The declining Lenin felt Stalin was a loyal comrade, but not particularly smart. When Lenin appointed Stalin as Commissar for Nationalities, he gave a simple reason. We don't need someone smart for that department, so let's send Stalin. Well, the not-so-smart Stalin became more and more important to Lenin as the leader grew weaker and his struggle with Trotsky for control of the party became more intense. Early in 1922, Lenin arranged for Stalin to get the new position of General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party. This was a new post in charge of mostly administering the Central Committee, but it also had a role in suppressing internal party opposition and centralizing party decision-making. It was bureaucratic work that many party heavyweights did not want, but Stalin liked it. His subordinates, like A.M. Nazaretian, often did not. In Stalin, Lenin has an entirely reliable Cerberus, who tirelessly guards the gates of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party. Lenin's illness made the internal power struggle more complicated, since it also raised the question of who would be the future leader. Trotsky seemed to be the frontrunner, but Stalin joined with top Lenin allies Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev in a so-called troika to oppose Trotsky. Soon afterwards, Lenin's health improved and he got more involved in party politics again and wanted to weaken the troika. So he decided to attack its weakest member, Josef Stalin. The starting point for the conflict was the debate around legally forming a new Soviet state. The Red Army had already conquered much of the former Russian Empire, and the Bolsheviks had installed several socialist republics, but there was still no legal basis to unite it all into one state. Stalin proposed the formation of a centralized Russian federation, which would include numerous semi-autonomous national territories. But Lenin had other ideas. He wanted to create a new state that would be a union of theoretically independent Soviet republics. Some of the Bolshevik leaders from non-Russian regions like Ukraine and the Caucasus wanted more independence from Moscow, and Lenin's union would be a way to give them some on paper while denying it in practice. In September 1922, Lenin criticized Stalin's Russian Federation plan, and Stalin gave in. The two also clashed on the topic of foreign trade and the status of Georgia, and these troubles were a sign of conflicts to come. So Lenin, Trotsky, and the Troika were struggling for power in the Communist Party that would soon rule a new state. At the same time, the final dramatic phase of the Russian Civil War was playing out thousands of kilometers from Moscow in the Far East. The counter-revolutionary white movement was a shadow of its former self in 1921 and 22. The Reds had driven them from the north, the south, and most of Siberia, which left only a fragile white presence in the so-called Far East Republic, or the DVR. The DVR actually had two competing governments, a Bolshevik one based in Chita and controlled by Moscow, and a white provisional government in Vladivostok. The whites actually worked with a democratic parliament, the Zemstva, but also depended on the support of the large Japanese occupying force. They didn't have full control over the Pacific Maritime region either, and local Bolsheviks were actively trying to bring it under the control of Chita and Moscow. The whites also had some control over the Priamur province after they launched a coup there in 1921. The Japanese support for the whites was also uncertain. Many Japanese politicians wanted Tokyo to withdraw its troops, and the United States also pressured Japan to leave Russia. The Japanese military argued that they should stay to prevent Bolshevism from spreading to Japanese-controlled Manchuria and Korea. Russians of most political stripes also resented this foreign presence. The local population hesitated as to whether they should support the Bolsheviks or the whites, as white General Viktorin Molchanov admitted. The population as a whole treated our government with restraint, which made sense, because they never knew when the Reds would come. Of course, the refugees from provinces to the west supported us much more openly, but the local population was not sure that our government would hold on. So they had to be careful. Despite their weakened state, the whites attempted an offensive to capture the Siberian town of Khabarovsk in December 1921, but it was then recaptured by the Reds in February 1922, and the whites pulled back. Summer 1922 sealed the fate of the whites in the Far East. In Vladivostok, the Zemstva asked white General M.K. Dietrichs to take on dictatorial powers, which he did. He tried to win over the people with religious propaganda and even proclaimed Grand Duke Nicholas as the new Tsar of Russia, but he found few takers. In Japan, elections brought a new government to power, which announced in June that Japanese forces would be leaving Siberia by October. Most of the whites left with them for exile in China, and some played important roles as advisors and mercenaries for local warlords, although others ended up as far afield as California. The Japanese withdrawal was the last real military barrier to a Red victory in the east. Bolshevik forces took control of Vladivostok on October 25, 1922, and 3 weeks later, the DVR formally joined with Bolshevik Russia. So the last white state and the last foreign troops were gone from Russia in fall of 1922. But as the Reds closed in on Vladivostok, one group of whites decided to continue the struggle in Yakutia, one of the most remote and coldest regions in the country. In Siberia's north, indigenous Yakut and Evenk peoples had formed an anti-Bolshevik movement in 1921 and 1922, but they were desperately short of weapons and experienced officers to face Red Army units, so they sent messages to the Whites in Vladivostok asking for help. Despite the precarious position of the Whites, General A.N. Pepelyaev hatched a plan. He would join the rebels in Yakutia, establish a new base for the anti-Bolshevik forces, and get the peasants to join his cause with an appeal to faith and the fatherland. By the end of summer 1922, he'd formed the 1,000-strong Siberian volunteer force called Druzhina after a medieval Russian unit. They sailed from Vladivostok to Ayan and then marched some 400 kilometers to Nyelkan, where they hoped to find river steamers that could take them down the river to Yakutsk. But the Bolsheviks had heard that they were coming and taken the boats with them. The isolated Whites were now stuck in Nyelkan and nearly starving. But in January 1923, the local Evenks and Yakuts gave the Whites enough food to survive the winter. In February, Pepelyaev's men occupied Amga and threatened Yakutsk itself. A Red Army detachment of 400 men moved up to the area, but the Whites surrounded it at a place called Sasyl-Syzyhy for a brutal 20-day siege. Temperatures were absolutely frigid in the Siberian winter, and Bolshevik troops built field fortifications out of the frozen corpses of the fallen from both sides. In early March, a Red Relief Force arrived, and Pepelyaev was driven off. The defeated Whites then marched 600 kilometers back through the frozen tundra to Nyelkan, where locals helped them get to the coast at Ayan. There, the Whites started to build boats to make their escape by sea, but in mid-July 1923, 1,000 Red Army soldiers made an unexpected landing, and the Druzhina surrendered. A Bolshevik court sentenced Pepelyaev and 26 officers to death, which was then commuted to 10 years in prison. Ironically, Pepelyaev and the Red officer who defeated him at Sasyl-Syzyhy were later shot in Stalin's purges of 1938. The Battle of Sasyl-Syzyhy is sometimes considered the last battle of the Russian Civil War, but historians debate when the conflict really ended. Some point to continued Georgian partisan resistance against the Reds until 1924, while others stretch the conflict all the way to 1926, when the sporadic violence in Central Asia finally stopped. So while the Russian Civil War was ending on the margins of the old empire, back in Moscow the communist power struggle continued, and a new empire was born. After Lenin got the better of Stalin in the debate over what sort of state the Bolsheviks would create to unite their conquests with Russia, the way was free for the creation of the new Union. Delegates of the four theoretically independent Soviet republics gathered to approve the change: the Russian SFSR, the Belarusian SSR, the Ukrainian SSR, and the Transcaucasian SFSR. Together, they signed the Treaty on the Formation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and an accompanying declaration. The document stated that the formation of the USSR was necessary for three reasons: to reconstruct the economy devastated by the First World War and the Civil War, to defend the republics against imperialist aggression from abroad, and to unite the working classes of the world into a single socialist community. The treaty also expressly allowed new member republics to join in the future, and for any republics to leave if they wished, although this was a legal fiction for the next 70 years. In a nod to the party's internationalist aims, the cover sheet of the treaty was in 4 languages: Russian, English, French, and German. And so the USSR formally came into existence on December 30th, 1922, a state unlike any other in Europe. Stalin gave an enthusiastic speech to the Party Congress. Comrades, this day marks a turning point in the history of Soviet power. It places a landmark between the old period, now past, when the Soviet republics, although they acted in common, yet each followed its own path and was concerned primarily with its own preservation, and the new period, already begun, when an end is being put to the isolated existence of the Soviet Republic, when the republics are being united into a single union state for a successful struggle against economic ruin, and when the Soviet power is concerned not only with its preservation, but with developing into an important international force, capable of influencing the international situation and of modifying it in the interests of the working people. On January 1st, 1923, Soviet newspaper Izvestia carried the news to soon-to-be Soviet citizens. The creation of the Soviet Union is a New Year's gift to the world proletariat. But there was a caveat. Against Stalin's wishes, a Ukrainian representative had urged that the treaty be accepted as preliminary and that it should be discussed by the separate republics for possible revisions before being formally ratified. The party delegates agreed that the USSR was established, but further amendments would be discussed at the next party congress. These discussions, however, never took place. The coming of the new state did not solve the political divisions within the Communist Party either. As the legal formalities of state building were being finalized in December 1922, Stalin and Lenin broke from each other for good. The Central Party Congress asked Stalin to protect Lenin's health by shielding him from visitors and receiving his letters directly. Stalin took advantage of the situation to further isolate the leader. Lenin was not ready to give up power, and he got around Stalin by having his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, deliver letters to Trotsky. Lenin was now working with Trotsky against the Troika. Stalin found out and yelled at Krupskaya, which angered Lenin. "You had the rudeness to shout at my wife and scowl at her. I do not intend to forget so easily what has been done against me, and, needless to say, what has been done against my wife I consider to have been done against me. Therefore, I ask you to consider whether you agree to take back what you said and apologize, or I prefer to break off relations between us." But Lenin was getting weaker, both politically and physically, and he had a serious stroke in December. He all but admitted to his sister Maria that he'd been defeated. "I have not died yet, but they, led by Stalin, have already buried me." In December 1922 and January 1923, he dictated a letter to the Party Congress that in effect became his political testament. In the letter, which his wife may have helped compose, he turned to the topic of his possible successor. He gave his opinion on Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and some others, but reserved his strongest criticism for Stalin. Stalin is too rude, and this flaw, which is quite tolerable in our midst and in communication between us communists, becomes intolerable for a general secretary. Therefore, I suggest that the comrades consider a way to remove Stalin from this position and appoint someone who has a single advantage over Comrade Stalin. Namely, he is more tolerant, more loyal, more polite, and more attentive to his comrades, and less capricious. Lenin's warning would not make much difference in the power struggle that followed his death. When Lenin died in early 1924, Stalin was one of the pallbearers, and he gave a series of lectures extolling Lenin's wisdom. He also learned from his contacts about Lenin's testament, which was still secret. As General Secretary, Stalin managed to delay the coming Party Congress as well. But when Lenin's testament was finally made known to party insiders in 1924, Stalin offered to resign, but the party refused. Even Trotsky came out in support of Stalin staying on in the name of internal unity, all but sealing Trotsky's own defeat in the race to power. Stalin continued to use his role as General Secretary to appoint loyalists to important posts within the party. Lenin's factions ban had made the Central Committee an unchallenged organ, and Stalin could use his administrative powers far more effectively in his own interest. He cultivated important relationships with ambitious young party administrators and the leaders of the feared Cheka secret police. Trotsky now led a faction known as the Left Opposition that wanted to undo some of the new economic policy implemented under Lenin, since they felt it was too capitalistic. Stalin, however, was growing stronger and was clearly on the path to power. Influential Bolshevik Bukharin supported Stalin on the economic question, and he placed more and more of his supporters in key positions and forced the left opposition members farther from the important decision-making positions. In October 1923, Trotsky complained that Stalin was taking over the party. The participation of the party masses in the actual formation of the party organization is becoming increasingly marginal. A peculiar secretarial psychology has been established in the past year or so. Its main feature is the belief that the party secretary is capable of deciding every and any question, without even knowing the basic facts. Stalin and his hand-picked members of the committee, however, accused Trotsky of the by now dreaded factionalism. Stalin also turned against his former Troika allies, Zinoviev and Kamenev, in late 1924. They in turn joined forces with the left opposition to form the united opposition against Stalin, but he threatened them with expulsion from the party and they were forced to recant. By 1928, Stalin had gained complete control of the Communist Party and began his long rule as dictator of the Soviet Union. And his first order of business was to collectivize agriculture, and in so doing, bring the war against the peasants to new heights of brutality and mass murder. Years later, Stalin's power would reach its peak in 1945 at the end of World War II. We also made an epic documentary about the Battle of Berlin in 1945 called 16 Days in Berlin. It's 4.5 hours long, over 18 episodes, taking you through the battle day by day. It features original film footage from Soviet cameramen, never-before-seen photos of the battle, detailed maps and animations, and expert interviews with David Willey from the Tank Museum, Ian from Forgotten Weapons, and more. Unfortunately, we can't upload this series to YouTube because it shows the grim reality of the Second World War, and that would get us demonetized or worse. So where can you watch 16 Days in Berlin in 4K resolution? On Nebula, a streaming service that we built together with other creators and where we can upload documentaries without the fear of demonetization. We want to thank Sofia Shirogorova for her help with this episode. And as usual, you can find all our sources for the episode in the video description. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War, a production of Real-Time History and the only YouTube history channel that has an entirely reliable Cerberus.